to get both of you to briefly introduce yourself and what got you interested. We're going to be talking about the trans conversation that's happening, now in general. I think it's important for us to even discuss how we talk about it in a more healthy way. So just a brief introduction for each of you and what got you interested in the topic in the first place and why you view that as an important thing to talk about. We'll start with you, Bree, and then we'll go to Christina.
Sure. I have been interested in this for a long time. I've seen the trans movement over a lot of iterations. I remember it when it was just whispers in the 80s. I remember it through the Jerry Springer era. I remember when it made the cover of major magazines, and I've seen it lately. And, what has been really heartening for me is seeing trans people get expanded access to healthcare over my lifetime. There are a lot of policies I think younger people especially take for granted, like being able to change your documents. And this just was not available several years ago. So I think we're seeing, with some of the tactics of recent years, a real backslide. I think the entire political project has really veered off course. That's making it more and more difficult to get buy-in from a mass public. So that's kind of why I'm here today, is I want to kind of reset the conversation and focus on some policy objectives I think we can get buy-in from a wider electorate.
Sounds great. Christina.
Great. I'm a journalist. I became interested in this issue about 2 years ago. After reading detransition stories, I think, and finding a lot in common with them. And having had, a long time interest in debunking pseudoscience and skepticism and things like that, I started becoming sort of skeptical of a lot of mainstream media narratives. And, the more I sort of looked beneath the surface, the more inconsistencies I found. And so I've really been interested in taking kind of like a deep dive into like what the science behind gender affirming care says.
Well, for me, I think I represent sort of the average person, the average lay person. I think, a lot of times in these conversations, we focus so much on the extremes on each side, the people who are, hate all trans people and that's everything is a lie. And then on the other side, you have, any gender identity is just, we should do everything they want to do. For me, I think most people just would rather see people be happy and healthy and comfortable. And they just don't necessarily always understand what the right path for that is. And so there's a lot floating around. And that's where I think we should, I think it's become incredibly difficult to have these conversations because it's so polarized, so politicized. Yeah. But really, if what our goal is to have the best outcomes for people, which I think part of, where I brought both of you into this conversation is I think you genuinely do want both best outcomes. You might have different opinions on this and how we get there, but I think
I would call Christina a friend at this point. We talk all the time, and I think we have different political. I think we've come to different conclusions, but it's from a place of respect. And Christina, I really value like my friendship with you. I think I appreciate that when you publish articles about science, I can ask you in good faith like what it means, even if I'm trying to poke some holes in your logic or I appreciate the good faithness by which you've engaged me. That's very personally valuable to me.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you too, and I've appreciated your questions and your pushing back and stuff too. I think that helps strengthen my reporting as well when I get feedback from others, because I really don't want to be talking to like an echo chamber. Like I want my words and ideas to be tested, and I've really appreciated your contributions to the discourse lately as well. I think that we do need more of a moderate position. I think there is a lot of extreme rhetoric coming from both sides, and those tend to dominate sort of the public square. And also just sort of like distorts reality too. When you think a certain group of individuals has just only extreme rhetoric because those are the people you encounter most frequently online, but to them I would say you need to spend more time with these people in real life. And I'm talking about sort of from both sides, trying to understand where people are coming from, and not like this meme of people online that we see.
I'm not entirely sure that it's a meme, though. I mean, something that's been true for me my entire life is, trans people have been very heavily represented in chat rooms, like from the AOL days. Like trans people, you can read like trans textbooks from the 80s, and it will talk about how trans people love to spend time on the computer. So, what I think has happened, unfortunately, in my view, is I do think a younger and younger cohort is really driving the conversation. Yeah, I think, part of getting older is like people definitely challenge your ideas. But I also think like a constant I've found with trans friends that are over, say, 30 or 35 is they really feel pushed out of their own movement. They feel like they can't, offer perspectives. They feel really silenced. And what I think is unquestionably true is that the playbook of how trans civil rights are fought today is radically different in objectives, tactics, tone than it was 5 and especially 10 years ago. And I think it's really difficult to look at this and not conclude it's very much meant to the detriment of the movement. I mean, would both of you agree with that?
Definitely. And I think in particular too, this sort of the new sort of line is to de-emphasize the importance of a gender dysphoria diagnosis and move
Yes.
towards this sort of social identity that ostensibly anybody can adopt. And now it's not just transgender, but there's a spectrum of different gender identities which are highly appealing to young, creative types of people who kind of view it as sort of like another cool aspect to their personality now to sort of adopt a different kind of gender identity when, like I consider gender dysphoria a real diagnosis that people suffer from. Sometimes
So,
they are
Christina, oh, sorry.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
So well, I mean, sometimes people are misattributing things that are going on with their life to gender dysphoria, but it's still, I mean, I think the distress is very real. And I think that for some people, they will be better off and happier having transitioned and are living as a transgender person. I think that's an obvious reality. There are many people who are happy with their transition, and it's just about finding out how to, prevent people from making, decisions that they're not going to be happy with in the long term. I think we all want people to be happy with the decisions they're making with their medical care.
So
That was actually going to be my
yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
No. That was actually going to be my question, though. Is that do you recognize that in some cases, when somebody does have gender dysphoria, that transitioning process can have a positive impact on their life under the right circumstances? And Christina answered that, but Brianna, what's your view on that?
Well, I obviously think yes, and Christina, something I think we're in lockstep agreement on is this de-emphasis by the community on the role of clinicians in diagnosing this, in gatekeeping, and all of this has been disastrous. I want to be really clear. It's not that I don't understand the logic. There are a lot of parts of the United States where it's very difficult to get gender affirming care. And it is an arduous process. Like the way we did it, in the 80s and 90s, you had to go go to a therapist for 3 months, get a letter, then get on hormones. Like it was, we called it the Benjamins. It was a very arduous process. But something I think the trans community constantly tends to downplay is there there's a cost for action, and they are seeing the cost of gatekeeping and the problems that brings. And Christina, something I think we would really agree on is there's also a cost of inaction and choosing not to do something. There's a cost to throwing away all the gatekeeping and letting people be their own doctor and like not be diagnosed with this. And I think what is extremely clear to me in looking at this objectively is that there are a tremendous number of female to male transgender people. They're not being served by these medical pathways they're on, and they're not going to end up happy. And I think it's presenting a political problem for the trans movement, because as many detransitioners as there are today giving these narratives that are very, very frustrating for people that want trans healthcare, I think we're on a course where that number is going to quadruple, go up tenfold 5 years from now. And I think it's going to really be very detrimental for everyone's healthcare if we don't get that in check.
So what in your opinions do you think makes this topic so divisive, so difficult to talk about? Because you can see even in very progressive countries, they've had a lot of a very kind of liberal progressive approach to trans issues, but when certain things don't work, they've been able to roll back on certain things. But it seems like particularly in, say, the US, this doesn't happen in that way. What do you think made it so difficult to just have a really honest, factual conversation in good faith about this?
Well, as many people may know already, the cast review came out a couple months ago, and this sort of represented the largest sort of study that's been done so far on all interventions for youth regarding gender transition. And it came out with the conclusion that, there's very weak evidence supporting youth transition in minors. So, a number of countries in like Scandinavia have begun rolling back on placing more age restrictions on youth transition. And the US has so far decided that it is not going to abide by the results of the systematic evidence reviews, and they're sort of still on board with youth medical transition. And until the US-based medical organizations sort of change their stance, like it doesn't seem like Democrats will. Because in the United States, things are very polarized here between the political parties. And that's sort of why we haven't really seen, that's sort of why it's been taken up by a number of states now who have been enacting laws to place restrictions, age restrictions on, sex trait modification for minors, chemical and surgical sex trait modification for minors. So that's the current state of things right now.
So I do agree with that, but actually, Christina, I think this is a really good point for us to kind of explore the differences that you and I have, because I agree with you. I read the Cash report, and I've also read a lot of the criticism of the Cash report. And what I see, I want to be really respectful here, but what I see directionally from a lot of your readers and the audience of the people of like your site and the wider political project that you're part of, you look at the Cass report, which we both agree, it has it says there's very weak evidence for certain things with gender transition. There are very good critiques of that, but the conclusion that your political project has come to, in my view, is equally as unsupported by the science, because there are a lot of people in your camp that want to blow up the entire system. And, if you're saying like, we don't really know enough yet, the answer for this, in my view, is we need to keep studying and we need to do some really common sense things. It drives me crazy when I look at this stuff that the female to male and the male to female cohorts are treated exactly identically. And these are two cohorts that go on a very different trajectory as far as what the cost is of going through puberty, as well as your desistance rates. So, I think like we can sit here and you and I will be in agreement that this free for all transition, no medical like intervention involved, this approach by trans rights activists, I agree with you, that's nuts. But I think the opposite political playbook of let's blow up this entire ship, something that in my view you advocate regularly, I think that's equally unsupported.
In the European countries, when I say place restrictions on these treatments, they still allow them in research trials. So they are studying them. Like you said, we need more information. I don't know I don't think that's true in the United States. I think they're just sort of flat out age restrictions, postponing those types of decisions until the minor turns 18.
Right.
Well, the transitions for minors is really what gets, I think, most people really divided on this issue. And, the people who are against transitions generally, I would characterize their argument as, well, they're too young to make such permanent decisions for themselves, when we don't allow them all these other things. And then on the other side, the argument for transitioning as a young person is that you're going to have a better result from that transition. So you're not going to, have the issues associated with puberty, but also you're going to be a much more passing person, and there are definitely cases that I've seen of people who have transitioned when they were young, and they are incredibly happy and well adjusted, and you wouldn't even be able to tell anything about their birth identity, right? So that becomes, I think, really difficult, because do you protect the people who might transition when really that's not their issue? Christina, you talk a lot about autism being a connection, and then there is a lot of detransitioners, but at the same time, do you then prevent people from transitioning when they really need it, or it gives them a much better outcome? So how do you balance that?
So let me ask both of you a really honest question. And this is really personal. It seems to me you can't have this issue both ways. So as I was scrolling Twitter today, I saw the usual TERF accounts that love to take pictures of trans women that went through puberty, and maybe they are really large or tall or don't pass well or have jaws, and they love dehumanizing. They
I know, I
love
hate it.
dehumanizing those people. And I guess my question to both of you is, would you be willing to go through life like being the size of a linebacker, or having gigantic biceps, or having a jaw that made you look like Arnold Schwarzenegger? I mean, do you understand, like, we're talking about the cost of doing things and not doing things. Do you understand that when you're denying someone access to healthcare in childhood, you're basically dooming a large part of that subset to this? And even with FFS, just, I don't want to get graphic, but take the double jaw surgery. So if a trans woman wants to shrink her jaw, she's going to have to go up here to her mouth. She's going to have like literally a hacksaw taken across her gum line. They're going to take out some part there for the double jaw surgery, glue it back together with metal, and then go into the chin, and then saw off the chin, and then do a facelift after the fact.
Oh,
That is incredibly painful. There are non-trivial complications, and that's like the best case scenario for someone that goes through puberty. So do you understand that by advocating these positions, the extremist version of this position, you're really dooming a lot of people to a life that is going to be much, much harder?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating for that position, but
Yeah.
I think you bring up an interesting point there, that by not allowing sort of the puberty, starting that transition to puberty, or before puberty rather, that in the future they're more likely to take more dangerous, endanger their lives more by doing these procedures. And I guess the counter argument also for some people would be that, You know, if listen, we're all born different ways. Sometimes there's nose deformities, there's all sorts of facial deformities. People have all sorts of issues that give them psychological turmoil. And some people will say, well, you should just accept that, which is can be very, very difficult. And other people are like, well, you get rid of it, right?
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult for me, for example, to have a super concrete position on this because I can really see both sides of it. That's why I do prefer for people to have their own choices rather than me choosing for them. But when it comes to young people, because there is all these, the danger again isn't in somebody who is legitimately has gender dysmorphia having that transition right early, but more so the people who don't. And in this current climate, I would say that it has become a little bit more difficult to assess. You know, I think there's a lot of distrust in the institutions because they are for profit, in terms of making that call, because I think some doctors are probably very responsible and really take their time and make sure that this is the correct diagnosis. But we've also heard of many cases where these diagnoses are made so quickly without, you know, fully considering everything about that particular patient.
Yeah, and I want to say too, like I'm not for anybody dehumanizing people. I think it's just horrible behavior that I see online constantly, and I probably don't even see maybe as much of it as other people because I block those individuals. But we also have to take into consideration that detransitioners have to go through a number of surgeries too if they want to reconstruct the parts of them that aren't there anymore. So it's difficult to balance the needs of both groups of people, I guess. But
Yep.
I just think that if we're talking about youth transition, I think that the risks outweigh the purported benefits, and it is something that decisions that adults should be making. And
Do we know the numbers of detransitioners who, you know, started on puberty blockers as opposed to people who stayed on, you know, through the journey and are still happy with their decision?
we don't have any long-term data when it comes to the gender affirming model of care that was sort of enacted in 2008, but it really sort of kicked off, and I guess in like 2014 and 2015 was when we started seeing sort of like the surge of adolescent youth who were seeking gender clinic services. So we really don't have a lot of long-term data to go off of. We know that there are some studies
with minors. Yeah.
Oh, with minors, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is that's what we're talking about here, though, right?
Which makes it really difficult because when I'm looking at something like this, you know, I'm trying to weigh out benefits versus harm. And, you know, if I knew that, you know, I don't know, just arbitrary number, like 50% of people regret that, then, you know, that's a really huge number. Versus, you know, maybe it's 1%. And then that's a really different conversation, I think.
But when we
So
don't
can I
have
give
the data,
sorry.
when we
No,
don't have
please
the
proceed.
data, we have to be cautious, right? Like we can't just offer youth medical interventions that we don't know are going to make them happy in the long term, that we know are associated with a lot of risks. Sorry, what were we saying?
No, I was just going to say, so this is where I get really frustrated with keeping male to female and female to male in the same cohort, because these are two complete, like when you're offering a surgery, I was talking to a surgeon about this literally 3 days ago. When you are talking about surgery, one of the first things you do is you define your patient pool cohort. And these two groups are radically different. Like, not only have they increased at completely different trajectories, with female to male being much, much higher,
Right.
but the danger of waiting is so much different in these two cohorts. So if a female to male trans person has to wait until they're 18 to get a double mastectomy, there's not really the same risk there as someone who is male to female who you're forcing to go through puberty. And something I've not seen a real discussion about here is this is a fact. Is if you like a lot of these cases with female to male trans people, there's a much higher desistance rate. Something that's different for the male to female trans people is if they are gender dysphoric before puberty and then after puberty, they are still gender dysphoric, there is a very, 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 very low chance of that ever abating. That is something they're going to deal with for the rest of their life, and they're almost certainly going to transition anyway. So I think, like, when I'm thinking about public policy compromises that we could make to like help everyone out here, I think stopping treating these same cohorts as though they have the same needs, there's a lot of evidence for this. I also think it's really clear that we need to radically raise the standards of who is considered who meets the standards enough to be on a medical pathway for minors. You can look at case studies, and there's a certain like stereotype for a trans person that's just never going to change. For a male to female, it's going to be like playing with Barbies, asking mom why they don't have a vagina when they're very young, singing into hairbrushes, preferring girl playmates, getting crushes on boys at 11, right? Like there's a certain amount of elements you have that are really, really, it's a high clinical bar that you can say with more certainty. The higher someone fits a case model, the more confidently you can prescribe a medical course of action. And this is where I would be very critical of the trans people coming in and activists upsetting a medical agenda, because I think we've lowered or even removed a lot of these standards in a way that has really been detrimental. Yeah, I'm sure you agree with that, Christina.
Yeah. The thing is though, like what you described, it's the same thing oftentimes for young gay male children.
Mm-hmm.
And the studies on gender clinics, from the past when there predominantly was young males who were showing up to gender clinics, there was a fairly high rate of desistance among that cohort. It was somewhere around, over 12 studies, it was somewhere between 60 to 90%. So there are some that definitely do persist, but a large majority of them just end up realizing like that they were gay. And then that better explained their experiences. So that's like one of the other reasons why that a lot of people are sort of cautioning against transitioning youth, because you need that time to sort of go through your sexual development and not have it kind of interrupted. It's just so difficult to tell who's going to be happy in the long term. I've met detransitioners who would have been perfect candidates for the Dutch protocol, which of course it's a lot they it's like several months longs of assessment, and they rule out autism and any other things going on, and they rule out non-binary identity and things like that. So even under that protocol, like I've met detransitioners who would be perfect candidates for it, but they still are now they're living as gay men now, but they don't have a penis, and I can't even imagine how difficult that is. I mean, that's a very permanent decision.
But the other way, if you have like in engineering, like if you have a 10% failure rate for like a tire falling off a car, that product would never come to market. And if you're doing a total ban the other way, 1 in 10 people are going to go through like male puberty. That's a lot of lives that are so much more difficult than they're going to have to be. And Christine, you wrote a story the other day looking at what the long-term mental health care outcomes are for the trans community. Like help me remember this. You were talking about how this was including a cohort of people over 40, overweight, smoking, lots of other comorbidities like depression. Like these are people that are they're having very difficult lives objectively. There's a lot of science to show that. So again, there's a risk to doing something and there's a risk to doing nothing.
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit like I have a friend who was diagnosed as bipolar, and she was given very like lithium, very serious medication. That medication had a really terrible impact on her because she was actually misdiagnosed. And I guess in some ways, I see a little bit of a similarity here. It's like, okay, do you not treat the underlying condition, because she did need treatment, but she was on the wrong treatment. Um, and there is consequences, to her life, to her brain, from treating her with the wrong medicine. At the same time, do you do nothing? And I think that's a bit of a crux in this particular part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think we really need to move away from the gender affirming model of care, the immediate affirmation of a trans identity and immediate referral for medical interventions, and move towards more of an individualized approach and sort of consider the whole person and everything else that might be going on with them, and just sort of be a little bit more cautious and slow, and taking more time to think. These are medical transition is a very big decision in a person's life, and I think there is value in waiting until you're an old enough age to sort of know yourself a little bit better, before proceeding with that. That's my view.
I hear what you're saying. I think there's a multifactorial thing that's going on here. So, Christina, I don't know if you read Reddit. I do. And, so I nearly DM'd you yesterday because I saw something I thought was just so disturbing. And it was a young person that was considering going on HRT, male to female, but they really, really, really didn't want boobs. They wanted to look like guess an anime trap, right? Like very flat chested, all that kind of stuff. Still have a penis. And yeah, I was just thinking about that, how this political project of it's not that I have a philosophical objection to wanting to do that to your body, but also for me looking at the science and the studies of it, I don't think we have a lot of evidence that these kinds of, I guess you would call it mix and match, outcomes for patients, that it leads to long-term psychological health outcomes, right? So I think that on one hand, you're talking about the automatic affirming model. I see a lot of evidence for just automatically affirming being kind of counterproductive in the long run. And I think I would also say, because transition is such a serious, painful, difficult thing, if you don't have to do this, that's probably a better outcome for you. So I think that we need to have more honest conversations about that, and how some of this wider trans rights framing for some of this stuff is not backed up by science. But at the same time, I think that if you put me in charge of this issue, one of the first things I would do is start to really hone in on developing a medical protocol. I don't think it's impossible to figure out with a higher degree of certainty who is a good candidate for this and who we need to tell to wait until they're 18. And to be clear, I'm entirely fine with making more people wait. I just think when you're shutting that door and you have a political project that is so cruel to people that don't pass, I think it's just you're leading people into abuse, and I think it's going to have a real cost.
Yeah, I think that's somewhere where we can probably agree on, is that the affirmative, you can affirm people in the sense that those are the feelings that they have, and then you investigate the rest of it, and you having a very concrete process and procedure based on data and information and research. Seems like that would be, if all practitioners had to sort of follow that same guide. And yes, maybe if you don't meet X and Y criteria, this is the pathway you take. And then, maybe you go back to the table after you get more, maybe you try other approaches, you try to deal with potentially other underlying issues, and then you still have the option to go back on the table. Like, I think there is a middle ground there that I think would be very helpful, because I think the biggest concern seems to be that, again, getting it wrong. And if you decrease the likelihood of getting it wrong, then I think there's a strong case to be made for going forward and making it right, which I know many people will disagree with, but ultimately it's the best.
I mean,
go ahead.
No, I think that's how things used to be done. It was like a very small number of young people. And I mean, this was sort of prior to there being sort of this big explosion and all of the social contagion and stuff like that. I mean, I think this was just a small number of individuals who strongly felt that way. And, it was up to the clinician at the time whether or not they felt like they could treat them. I don't know if we can go back to that. Like, I don't like what's that expression? It's already out of the bag. Like, I just don't know if we can get back there currently. I mean, that's ideally we would get back to that. I guess. But
I guess it would require a certain. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, just, I mean, U.S.-based medical organizations, they won't even like acknowledge that there's a problem. Like they're not doing their job.
It seems like a lot of that is also because it's become such a divisive, Republican versus Democrat kind of issue, and I think there is less of a willingness to acknowledge anything that might be sort of brought up by the TERFs or the Republicans and so on. So there is that, I think, that political environment. But then I think that if there is more of a movement by people who are involved in this, who are who have family members who might be trans, there might be more of a willingness to listen and create better systems. Is it possible when it's so far gone? I don't really know. But at the same time, I also know that a lot of people who are on the left really do have the same concerns. So it's not like it's this fringe thing that it's made out to be.
So, and I fully agree with that. And I think all three of us would agree there's a lot of trans extremism out there. For me, as I've really been looking for leadership on this and have come to the conclusion I need to be more vocal about trying to find a middle pathway.
You gotta be the leader.
I'm trying to, and I've taken a lot of heat from my own side about this, right? Professional consequences, I've lost friendships, it's exhausting. But, Christina, I have a really direct question for you.
Uh-huh.
And so I have gotten to know a lot of people kind of in your reporting beat. And like, I consider us friends. I respect you 10 out of 10. I've done interviews for your periodical. A lot of the reporters here, I've really taken an effort to get to know, because I do need a constructive relationship with that. But if you look on, say, the Blocked and Reported subreddit, it is a really viciously transphobic audience. And I think, respectfully, a lot of your comments are also that way for a lot of stuff that, Reality's Last Stand does. Certainly J.K. Rowling. And I think anyone objective looking at kind of this quote-unquote medical beat and looking at the audiences that you have gathered, I think it's really obvious that the political project is not dignity for trans people and really good outcomes for trans people. Like, they just hate trans people. There's just no way to argue that. They won't call them by the right pronouns. There's a lot of mocking people for how they look. It's, transphobic comments just up and down. So I think, like, how do you square I believe you're genuine in your public policy mission, but how do you square that with the fact that a lot of the audience that you've gathered really has a political project of eliminating trans people from life in the United States?
Um, yeah. I don't, I can't really speak on the audience I've gathered. Like I don't always read the comments. I think it's like when I've tried to sort of like every so often I try and sort of engage with people who have views that I disagree with, who are demeaning to trans people, and it always turns out to be a big headache.
Yeah.
Because they're just terrible people. And they live online and they will just wreck your mental health. And then you realize, like, after 2 days of like online fighting, like, what was the point of that? And I sort of try to just sort of ignore them and focus on my writing, because I actually feel like I'm making some progress on this issue with.
It's tough because anytime you post something that might be in alliance with somebody's views, right, worldviews, biases, they will sort of prop you up. And if you if you make it, the second they disagree with you, then they tear you down. But I agree with what you're saying in terms of what I've observed was, I think when this whole conversation became more mainstream, or at least mainstream online, I found that at first what I was mostly seeing is people saying, well, we're concerned about kids, or, we don't want to be compelled to use pronouns, things like that, that I think are very fair things to talk about. And then I was seeing, so it quickly grew from that to actually a lot of true hatred, bad faith, just cruelty. So, and that is part of it, and I think we need to acknowledge that as well when we're having these conversations, because it's not just like, let's, the other side just wants to protect kids and adults. It's very often, there's bullying tactics underneath that as well.
I try to lead by example, and I put my views out there and I say this is what I believe, and I try not to engage with the crazy people who live online, because it really just, it's so toxic. Like it's so terrible. And then they just take things you say out of context and quote tweet them and try to like wreck your reputation. And like, that's why I just mostly ignore them. But I know they're there. There's just terrible people online.
And, to be fair, there are a lot of trans rights activists that are equally as terrible. I will say this today. I think Ari Drennan is a horrible person. 2 days ago, she took, I did a tweet that caused a lot of conversation saying, I support this bill in California, and then I explained why. I don't think I think, if transgender issues are a threat to a child's health, I think those childs deserve health, and that, public school shouldn't hide that. And, what Ari did is she took a little screenshot of that at the top saying, I support this bill in California, left out all the context of like me wanting kids to get health care, retweeted it to her audience, and I dealt with harassment for days. It has been an absolute war on my Twitter. This is just the way, and she's not alone. This is the way a lot of that cohort behaves. I've said this on record repeatedly. Gamergate, I got a lot of press about the harassment Gamergate gave me. Trans Twitter is just as bad. It's the exact same tactics. It's take something you said out of, put a spin on it, send waves of people after you to unperson you and try to get you canceled from the internet. So there's tons of extremism here to critique. So I think like what I'm trying to do in my public role is I know for a fact there are a lot of trans people that feel really ill served by this extremism that has taken over this topic. They're tired of it. They do believe in medical safeguards. They do have questions about kids transitioning. They want policies to stop this extreme number of detransitioners. And they want healthcare providers involved with this. So that's what I'm trying to do. What I need on the other side is I need right wingers or people that are a little bit more antagonistic towards trans healthcare to stop being so goddamn cruel about everything. There's no reason to maliciously misgender someone who generally passes, is making a good faith effort, is medically transitioned. There's just no good reason to do that. Yeah,
it takes effort to do that. If somebody just, looks like a woman, even if
100%.
they're not, it's like, in my brain, it's hard to.
It's a political project to misgender them. It
just see a lot of like cognitive distortions on that side, as where it's they take this like all or nothing approach, where I just think that there's a lot more nuance to life and to this issue, where you don't have to take an all or nothing approach.
And part of it is a reaction also to being told, well, you have to do this, you have to accept this. But instead of just being a little bit more mature and nuanced about it, then they go really far the other way. Because I can understand people feeling like, hey, you shouldn't tell me what words to use. I should have a choice. They should have a choice. But that doesn't mean that they have to then intentionally do this to hurt somebody who's not the person necessarily telling them to do that. And there is this kind of monolithic view of everybody too, because if you talk to trans people, they're so all over the place about all these issues, like really all over the place, and just like any other human being. And I think in all things, viewing everybody as this monolith and then just picking a few people to represent that monolith, and people they don't like, for people who are aggressive activists, I don't think that's very healthy. Yeah. But I would love to talk about, the California Safety Act, which is something that was brought up. And I know you both maybe have a similar conclusion, but from different angles. But, just for people watching, it's basically an act that forbids schools from adopting any policy which would force them to disclose a student's trans identity. So it doesn't mean that they can't, from what I understand. It means that they have a choice not to. So, for example, if they think that maybe the student is afraid or not ready, it sort of leaves it in the hands of the student. But at the same time, what parents are concerned about is so the schools kind of try to protect them from abuse. But what parents are concerned about is like, well, if my child is struggling with this, I should be able to be there, like with any issue, and try to help them out. And you're assuming bad faith on the parents' part from the get-go. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, one of the issues with that bill is that it kind of lumps together sexual orientation and gender identity. That's one issue. And like, there are some situations that are context dependent. Like if there is a 11-year-old that adopts a trans identity is much different from like a 16 or 17-year-old who is not ready to come out at home with their parents, but wants to confide in their teacher or something like that. So it's, there's a lot of big differences between those two different scenarios.
I fully agree. I think, I think that one of my missions in my wider career is about generating political will for public policy. And again, coming back to this like theme of there's a risk to doing something and there's a risk to not doing something, I understand the risk of a child being outed to their parents against their will. When I came out to my parents, they disowned me immediately. I've not talked to them in literally 23 years, I think. So, and I was terrified of them growing up. I remember like biking to the USM library to read LGBT books to just learn about stuff. So I have tremendous empathy for that. But at the same time, I think the risk that a lot of trans people are underestimating here is I talk to a lot of people, I talk to a lot of parents, and I talk to a lot of Democrats. And there is I'm sure if I went and pulled this, I would find a lot of anger and terror at the idea that your school, your public school, could potentially be transitioning your child behind your back. I don't think that's something most people in America are going to
Does the
stand with.
bill
Yeah.
allow that? The actual transitioning of the child by the school?
So here's how this works. That's a
Yeah.
really good question. So, Catherine, the way it's a long answer, so let me give it to you. There's a culture now that if a 16-year-old wanted to go out and get HRT, they could go on the internet, they could pay cryptocurrency, and they could have it shipped to them. And they could start on HRT immediately. And this is wildly popular, actually. So you're doing that without endocrine, like blood levels being checked. You don't know what the dosage is. You're not checking for what it's doing to bone density, things like that. So it is entirely possible through this bill that a child could be socially transitioning at school, taking HRT with information they got in a Discord, and the parents just would not know, right? Or they'd know something was up with their child, but they wouldn't know about all of this. So yes, I do think that can happen.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognize too that a social transition isn't a neutral act. That was the language that the National Health Service used, that um it can be like an iatrogenic intervention where oftentimes sort of solidifies the pathway to a trans identity and medical intervention. So it's not just sort of like, it sounds nice. It's like, oh, we're just gonna let them change their name and pronouns and affirm their identity. Like it does solidify the pathway towards
Well, I
medical
can
interventions.
imagine that part of that is because, well, if everybody is accepting this identity, is supporting this identity, it's harder to, like with anything, it's harder to then go, maybe I'm not this. Like it's harder to introduce doubt into it or change one's mind, especially when everyone sort of rallies around that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're living as that identity, I guess, for a certain amount of time. At the same time, it's sort of hard. Like, I guess it makes sense for people. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking out loud here, but I guess it does make a sense for it to happen once there is a level of treatment. By treatment, I mean, like, talking to medical professionals, psychologists, making sure that that's correct, and then that could be the slow way of dealing with it. Um, it's so tricky. Like I'm listening to you both, and I imagine a lot of people get a bit confused about what the right thing is or what the
Yeah.
right step is. And but I guess with this bill, it would assume that the parent is a dangerous parent and not
Right.
tell them, which has sort of not been proven in any way. And
Yeah,
if
these
there
are
is a basis, yeah.
mostly very, very liberal left-leaning states. So like they're already accepting of gay and trans people. Like that the idea that they wouldn't accept their child um if they came out.
A
Oh,
lot of
great.
the
Okay.
homeless rates for trans people are pretty hard if you look at it. And I don't think just because
You
you
mean
vote
for
Democrat, you are
minors?
going to love your child. Yeah, 100%, or at least it was 20 years ago. I don't know if that's changed.
I mean, we're
Yeah, I
dealing with a
think
different cohort from 20 years ago than we are today.
We'll look that up and find out. But I
Okay.
think what I would say here is, if child abuse is going to happen, there's no good way for that to happen, obviously. And I'm sure, like, especially with this anti-trans and atmospheres we're living in, I have no doubt a lot of those children are going to be dealing with abuse. But I think if the school is in the loop on this, I think that's when you can get CPS involved. You can make sure those schools are safe, and I think all of us would agree. Like if if a public school knows that abuse is happening to a child, like they have a responsibility to get that child like to a safe situation. So I think like if I come at this from a position of I want those children to have health care, and I think the danger of taking these internet hormones without an endocrinologist involved, this is huge. This is not something like Christina will tell you. The bone density, is a real issue if you go on puberty blockers. So there's all these complications that can happen. And I think those children deserve real health care, not Discord health care, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there is a sense that, oh, we're so past the LGBTQ also, where like everyone is accepting unless you're, I don't know, in a middle state. First of all, there's a lot of people in middle states who happen to be gay, and are not accepted, and more recently. I think we've come a really long way. I think the environment is much, much, much better. But whether liberal or Republican, I think, or Democrat, Republican, whatever, right wing, whatever framework you want to use, it's just both are capable of discrimination. And I'm just thinking, even when I went to school, I'm probably most of the people in my school were left leaning, and yet they said uttered incredibly homophobic things. And I think a lot of them have progressed since then. Same as on the right. I think a lot of people on the right have absolutely progressed as well in terms of accepting people and not judging them for it. But you could go online, you see how much hate there is, and you can also look at people's stories more recently where they have had a hard time with it, from their family accepting them, and other types of discrimination. We've come a long, long way. Doesn't mean we've solved it.
Yeah.
And with trans, I think it's even more. It's still not. It's not been that long since people can just be publicly trans.
In my friend group, I can think of there are about 2 people that still have good relationships with their family. So
Wow.
I think it's, it's really rough.
It is rough, and it's unfortunate, but yeah. I mean, the other thing, Christina, I wanted to bring up was this the claim. So there was a claim floating around about the large rise in suicide in young gender dysphoria patients at the Tavistock, I think, Institute. And apparently this was debunked and the claims were labeled as dangerous. So I just wanted, if you can give the audience a little bit of context as to what Tavistock is, where these claims came from, and what makes them, if you agree that they're dangerous, what makes them dangerous?
Well, what was it called? The Good Law Project, I think. I'd have to review who was making these claims, but there was sort of these claims that were going around a few weeks ago that there was like a surge in youth suicide at the National Health Service in England, the Gender Identity Development Service. It's now been shut down, and it's moved to more like centralized locations. But I think there were concerns that there were a number of youth who had committed suicide while they were waiting for gender transition treatment, that alarmed a lot of people. But the Department of Health and Social Care recently just published a review of these claims, and they had access to all the data from NHS England, and they found that there wasn't much merit to them. So there were some suicides, but it's very difficult to attribute the reason to them. They're usually multifactorial reasons. God, I think it was, I'm looking at it now, I think it was 12 suicides in total. Half were under 18. This was the time frame, was it?
So you're also dealing, I mean, I imagine that part of the suicide statistics in general, even outside of this, because there is a lot of suicides, but a large part of that is because there are possibly other underlying issues beyond just being struggling with your identity. Depression, maybe family issues, all sorts of things like that. And I think that all gets lumped together, and it's hard to know because you can see that even there's often claims made also that if you transition, it increases suicide rates. But, if you really look at it, often it is because there were other underlying issues that were not addressed when those people transitioned.
That has sort of shown that too. I mean, these are young people who are having a really hard time. The rates of suicide are high regardless of whether or not they transition.
So, I mean, and this would be my critique of this study is, look, I fully, so just to back up for a second, something I think the trans community needs to stop doing today is telling parents that if they don't give their kid everything they want, they're going to kill themselves.
Yeah.
A, it's not true. It's not productive. 3, it is setting up a system where a lot of kids are being funneled into healthcare outcomes that I don't think are going to serve them in the long term. So that talking point needs to stop today. But I also think it's important to note that suicide is not the only negative outcome that can happen for a trans child that does not get healthcare. Spend some time in the trans community. You're going to see people with drug abuse issues. That's everywhere. Depression is everywhere. Social anxiety is everywhere. Bipolar disorder. It's almost like if you have gender dysphoria, spin the roulette wheel and see what comorbidity is going to come up with it. And that's what you're going to need to be treating along with this. So, I think if it had taken a wider view of negative health outcomes, that encompassed more things than suicide, I would find this more credible. But just because one bad health outcome isn't there, it doesn't mean everything's not there.
That's a good point. Christina, autism, I mean, that's something that has been connected usually with misdiagnoses, not correct diagnosis. Is that correct?
We don't have a lot of data on the misdiagnosis. That's a generally accepted idea, I guess. But there are high rates of autism and high rates of autistic traits among those who are showing up to gender clinics that are youth. And I'm imagining the adult population too, although I've been mostly reviewing the data on youth. So there's a 2018 study at GIDS that found that the youth there had there was a 35% moderate to severe autistic traits, not including mild traits, which was close to 50%. And there's been some gender clinics in the United States even that have about a 50% autism diagnosis rate. So it is very prevalent. And then I've proposed the idea that I think because a lot of young girls do not receive an autism diagnosis until they're an adult, which is what happened to me, that I think it can explain at least some proportion of the youth who are searching for an explanation as why they feel different from everyone else and don't fit in with their peers or are more gender nonconforming, and landing on gender dysphoria and trans identity because it's talked about a lot these days and it's more recognizable. And they may be misattributing some of their traits to a trans identity. Because I've spoken to a number of detransitioners who, upon receiving an autism diagnosis in adulthood, realized that better fit their experiences and led to the decision to detransition. So I figured out that's what it was, But this isn't this was just my hypothesis. This isn't widely accepted, and I haven't even published this survey yet.
Well, that's really interesting. When I was reading about detransitioners, I have found that a lot of them were on the spectrum.
Yeah.
So it seems like an interesting, at least the hypothesis is worth investigating.
Definitely.
I'm curious, is there, other than transitioning, if somebody has a legitimate case, where they don't associate their gender with their what they're born as, what is is there any other treatment course that has ever been suggested that people have put forward?
Are we about to get into Blanchardism? Oh no.
I don't know. I mean, I know, because usually when I ask, I've never actually had anybody tell me of an alternative that actually works, right? But it's sort of I'm not suggesting conversion therapy or anything.
No, that's not
like,
Blanchardism. That's not Blanchardism.
oh, tell me. I don't even know.
Oh,
Well-
boy.
Well, you're Blanchard. I mean, you're talking about autogynephilia. That's
Well, that's
that's
different.
a
Those
pathway
are
to
different.
transition, and
Well,
Catherine's talking about other treatment options, right?
I'm saying there are
Yeah.
some people. So what I saw 20 years ago is, there were people that were like 40 years old and they had a wife and they had a wife and they had children. They'd been in the military their whole life and they knew they were never going to be able to pass. So what they did is, they were fetishistic cross-dressers, right? And, I think there's some people today. I think it's not everyone that's AGP, but I think there are some people that are AGP that don't necessarily need to transition, right?
Yeah. Or they may
You
not
know,
even know that they have it because there's been such a
that's right.
suppression of this dialogue. I think people need to have access to this information so they can decide what might be best for them. Because if they're just told, like, oh, if you have these feelings, that means you're trans, you should transition.
Right.
They might make a different decision if they're taught about autogynephilia, and they might decide a different pathway for their life. But you weren't done talking, I don't think.
No. It was
Oh.
brilliantly said. I completely agree. I also feel like there's this real misnomer out there. Like what I've seen from a lot of turf tweets is talking about everyone with AGP as though they're not really trans or whatever. And
Well, they
one
talk
of
about
my
them like they're not human too.
That's
Like
right,
it's terrible.
100%. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
One of my very closest friends, like she's HEP, she transitioned, her feelings resolved, like she cross-dressed her entire life, stopped. If you talk to her, like she dresses more conservatively than I do. She has a job, she has a long-term partner, she passes. She's just like by every standard, just a normal woman. And I think that like there are these success stories that are not being told because we've demonized this so much. So, I think that I'm not sure that with Blanchardism, like, HSTS versus AGP, I'm not sure that's the whole story. But what I can say is in my friend group, there are people that have found understanding AGP very powerful for them understanding
Mhm.
themselves. And I wish we could have a more honest discussion about
Yeah.
that.
Well, what you were saying, AGP and homosexual pathway. I
Yeah.
think at the time that study was published, those were probably the two pathways. But I think people might be more open to additional pathways. I think some people consider ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria, another path to transition. I would even consider autism another pathway towards transition.
Oh.
But I mean, if we're just talking about sexual orientation, that's the reason why they were sort of divided by the two. Is one is the homosexual pathway towards transition, and autogynephilia is typically a heterosexual male who is attracted to the idea of themselves as a woman.
I think a lot of times people, when they talk about it, they sort of refer to people who might have genuine sort of a sense of being in the wrong body and with transition as actually, as there being other ways to deal with it. Just accept yourself as you are kind of mentality, which, if they could do that, I imagine they would do that, but that's not the reality. But as far as I know, I mean, I'm not aware of therapies that focus on accepting yourself that have, been tried and failed or anything like that.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't know if there's just something that I'm unaware of or,
I guess I'm just saying, like, I think there is an attitude out there, and Christine, I'm going to assume you agree with me on this, that if you are, say, non binary and you want to go get medical interventions with this, that's a great idea. There's not a lot of research to back that up, and clinicians do it, right? And I think I think everyone that has gender dysphoria transition may be like it's for a large number of them, it is going to be a good fit for. I think it's okay to explore things with a therapist and see if it's really going to serve you. And I think that's something by like, I just think it's like a nuance that the activist community is not letting us have. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's sort of why like these definitions and conceptualizations of what trans is has gone through so many changes. Like, it was originally gender identity disorder and gender dysphoria, and now the WHO has just recently introduced with their ICD-10 gender incongruence, and they've like reclassified it as a condition related to sexual health rather than as a psychiatric condition with the explicit aim to reduce stigma. So a lot of this is led by activism rather than, whether or not this is actually the best fit for this condition that we're talking about, which is I just call it gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, that's what I see today is a lot of it is being led by activists, and a lot of researchers and doctors are just on board without really thinking, is this really a good idea?
I also think, like, if you truly care about trans people, I think a lot of these activist messages are setting people up for failure in the long run. Like, if you go read Reddit, there's a lot of messages out there saying you don't need to voice train, you don't need to shave if you want to transition. Like, it's fine, you're good. Trans women are women, automatically, end of story. There's no discussion. And, I've always thought of it like, becoming a woman is like you call it transition for a reason. You
Yeah.
are transitioning. There's stuff that you need to do to get there. And I think, like, one message I think that is helpful for people is to take agency in their own lives, right? Look at what you need to do to be perceived the way that is going to bring you mental health and peace, and then go do those things. We've opened the door. Like, I was right there with the fight with Obamacare to expand it to include things like FFS, my own state of Massachusetts. This has changed tremendously over the last 16 years I've lived here. So I think, like, we have tools that are out there for people, but I think when your mission is like this political burn everything down to the ground versus integration, I think we're telling a lot of people not to take advantage of these tools that is going to make their life easier for them. And I think that's an attitude that's not serving the community.
Yeah. Part of the shift towards away from a psychiatric condition and towards like this innate gender identity that they say people are born with, everybody has a gender identity, and they say that if you have a mismatch between the gender identity and the body, then you're said to be transgender. Like, that's consistent with the belief that, trans children know who they are and then should transition so that they don't go through the wrong puberty. Like, it's all kind of like it's a package. And I think it was a mistake to do that. I think we should talk about gender dysphoria as a psychiatric condition, like as a legitimate psychiatric condition. Some people are going to transition. Some people are going to be happy with their transition. I think those are things that we all can accept is true. But it's just a matter of, making and helping activists see that, like, moving away from gender dysphoria as a psychiatric condition is led to a lot of bad outcomes.
I guess that's where also you get a lot of criticism because, or from some people, where it's like, okay, well, if it's a psychiatric condition, for no other condition do we do anything but, say, use pills, right? You don't cut off body parts and things like that. You don't change into that what is reflected in that psychiatric condition. What's kind of your thinking on that? Maybe Bree.
I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that transition leads to positive mental health outcomes if it's been properly diagnosed. Yeah, I've always thought of this, and I got some pushback from a friend of mine that's an actual clinician the other day, so I'm going to put an asterisk on this, but this is how I think about it. That if you take someone that's trans and you look at the 6 criteria in the DSM for gender dysphoria, and they go and they transition, they go to an HRT, they get surgery, they have FFS, they pass, they're going through their life normally. At that point, they're not going to meet those 6 criteria. It seems like it's a condition that then at that point would be treated or in remission, like it's something you've dealt with, right? So I think considering that there can be an end to this gender dysphoria for a lot of people, I don't know. I think that's something. It's a positive message. It's a good outcome.
But it
I
is
guess if there was
something.
a go ahead,
Sorry, but
Christine.
it is something that you have to continually take hormones for. That's why
Sure.
that's why the diagnosis is still used today, is to be able to access medical interventions like through insurance and things like that.
Sure.
And it's expensive because whether it's surgeries or hormones, like not everything is covered everywhere. And also, like, some people where they have more financial means are able to pass better. Um, but we don't necessarily see it as, medicine, I guess. And even though if you look at the outcome, I guess it is, at the same time, I suppose if there was a pill that you could take, and that causes your psychiatric condition to disappear, then I imagine people would take that, but there isn't one. And so then you have this one option, at least, that's being offered.
Do you want to know a dirty little secret about detransitioners, Catherine?
Tell me.
So a lot of them. So first of all, the cost of estrogen is pretty much nothing. You can go to cost plus drugs right now with a prescription, and if you're taking 4 milligrams, a very standard dose, no insurance involved, just paying cash yourself, is $10.60 a month. So not really a super expensive thing. Like once you're done with surgery and just maintaining for years, like you do the procedures, you're done. A dirty little secret about people that transition in their HEP, I was astonished to learn this, is a lot of them stay on the estrogen because the sexual paraphilia like comes back and it gets out of control for their lives. So like even if you detransition, a lot of them end up staying on HRT to some degree to help their mental health, even if they're back in a male gender role. I was very surprised by that.
Wow,
Wait,
that's
is that
interesting.
from reading Reddit posts?
Nope.
Wait,
What would
how,
be the source for that, I guess?
It's from everything I've seen over my entire life.
Okay.
oh, because you've known detransitioners throughout your life.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Detransitioners are not new.
Yeah. I'm usually looking at things through this lens of, happening right now and within the last few years, but I forget that it's people have detransitioned for a long time too.
Do detransitioners get accepted within, are they seen as sort of the enemy, or are they accepted by trans individuals?
I mean, this is how we're having the stupidest possible conversation we could, right? They are treated as the enemy. They're told to shut up. I don't think it helps that there's a whole political project out there to hand them a mic and encourage them to tear down the entire healthcare infrastructure for trans people. But I think ideally, you would want them to be happy, just like you'd want any sister to be happy.
Well, I wouldn't say they're trying to tear down the whole healthcare infrastructure for trans people, like adults. I mean, it's still always going to be available for adults, but I think we're raising awareness about why they maybe should have been treated with more caution as youth and not affirmed so quickly with medical interventions. Just, I think, a worthwhile conversation.
You don't think like Ray Ann William Ray whatever Ray who we call Ray GP, you don't think his political mission is to kind of dismantle the idea of trans people and to get people not to transition and to just kind of be the same as him?
Didn't he detransition recently?
Reasonably recently, yeah.
Oh, I mean, I I think we follow each other. I haven't followed all of his posts extremely carefully. But
I mean, how about Corinna? Right? You know, kind of very antagonistic to trans people.
Corinna? I haven't noticed her being antagonistic.
I'll show
I've
you some
definitely
links.
seen
Yeah.
I've definitely seen some of that, and then I've seen some that are just concerned about the wrong outcome for people like them. But so I think both sort of exist from what I've seen.
I
I'm
do see
curious.
detransitioners getting kind of swept up in all of the turf dialogue too. I mean, I do see that. So it definitely happens. Because I mean, I think a lot of people are just drawn to social movements online, and they go from one to the other.
I think a lot of people are drawn to extreme viewpoints in general. And I think, in particular, when they don't engage in a healthy discourse, perhaps because it's not even afforded to them, I've seen them just get more radicalized. And it's not just on this topic, it's on every topic. I've seen a lot of people who, even like the whole anti woke thing, right? I've seen people where they start out with a pretty reasonable take on pushing back on some of these sort of the intolerances of what has been dubbed woke, redubbed, I guess, woke. From a different from its original meaning, obviously.
Yeah, but
But then you get so
sorry.
far.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I just noticed that a lot of these people, where they started from a very sane position, have pushed in part because they then over focus on the people who are extremists or activists or all that,
Mhm.
and they're only pushing back on them in a way that I think makes them a lot more extreme themselves, and then their positions no longer are as sensible as when they started. And I see the same kind of story going on with this topic, where some people might have started out pretty reasonable and some absolutely remained that way, but some people have gotten more further and further, and also they've created echo chambers, right? So, and they've been audience captured, because if you're creating content that's all like anti about this topic, and you end up getting a following that expects something from you, and that's all you focus on. So I think that moves people from a more sort of reasonable position to something a little bit more extreme.
I can speak to that personally, Catherine. You know, for me, having really taken a step and tried to find a middle road here, I've gotten so blasted and frankly harassed out of my mind by trans Twitter. It's really easy for me to imagine what happened to J.K. Rowling, like just becoming completely radicalized by these people. So, no, I fully agree with you. I think it's really hard because there's no constituency in the middle trying to look at good healthcare outcomes here. I mean, as best as this is literally the best conversation I've ever had about trans stuff right here.
Yeah, that's good.
And I mean, y'all are great, but I also think that's sad in a way, because it's just so rare to have good faith dialogue about this.
Yeah.
And I've definitely seen disagreements between you and Christina, but they're done in such a way where it's like you're just two people trying to figure things out, maybe have slightly different perspectives or experiences. And really, that's what a good conversation should be. Because the idea, like, if I'm only talking to people who agree with me, that's incredibly boring. But not just boring, it's not giving me anything, right? But what is happening in a lot of conversations is that it becomes a competition, or it's framed as a debate, which is like why I don't really like debates, because debates are ultra focused on winning and not conceding any ground. And again, that's why we're seeing people get more and more extreme in their views, because they are adversarial to each other instead of talking to each other and disagreeing, but disagreeing in a way where they can also concede ground. And I think it's so important to concede ground, and also to know that you don't know everything, and also to know that maybe you don't have a firm. I get attacked all the time for not having, pick a horse, right? And like, I have very strong views about certain topics. I know exactly where I stand. And there are some topics where it's like, it's confusing to me because I can see both sides so well. And maybe in some cases, it's like, okay, my worldview aligns with this position a bit more than this one. though both are credible, and other times where it's like, I don't have such a clear, I haven't come up with a decision and people expect you to. And I think that causes, I just think it's incredibly unhealthy for discourse in society. Christina, I think you were going to say something.
Oh, um, yeah, with regard to extremism, like I've had so many bad interactions with, I guess, TERFs or radfems, I don't know, whatever they call themselves, that like I have such a bad I have so many bad interactions with them that I just want to tend to like view them all as bad, but I know that's not true. And I think the same thing happens with them with trans activists, where they have so many bad interactions with trans activists that they tend to view all trans people as the same way. And then that's when you get to the dehumanizing rhetoric and things like that. And it's, I have to resist that urge. And I've slipped up before, out of just so much frustration, where I've said things that are probably I shouldn't have, I guess. Um, but it's hard to resist that urge sometimes, and we have to really try um, that the extreme people speaking on behalf of an issue aren't representative of the entire group, and that we should sort of think about them as individuals rather than a vector for their whole group.
No, absolutely.
Or avatar.
Bree, we lost your sound, I think.
Oh, sorry
Oh,
about
there,
that.
we got you back.
No, I was just going to say, I fully agree with that, Christina. And Catherine, coming back to your point, it's also just not a productive way to arrive at public policy. It's just not how this works. I've been in the political game for a while. I've worked on a lot of initiatives. I've worked on a lot of bills and back channel. And the way public policy works is coalition building. That's just the reality of it. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's Republicans screaming at Democrats, but if you want to get something done, especially at the local or state level, the way to get that done is identify people that can have common ground and then to come together and try to pass public policy. So that's my mission here. Like, if we can get people that are sane and are truly interested, their highest mission is good healthcare outcomes for trans children or children that think they could be trans, and adults truly living lives with dignity, I think we can do that. I just really don't think we can do it on this course. And I've said this a billion times to Christina privately. I think this is what's most likely to happen if we stay on this course. I think we're going to lose everything with trans healthcare. What I think is going to happen is the number of detransitioners is going to skyrocket. I think the medical boards are going to step in. I think there's going to be political will to freeze this for adults. I think you're going to see FFS and GRS and other healthcare treatments discontinued with insurance. And I think trans people will lose everything if we stay on this course of action. So I am begging people to step away from this culture online of harassing everyone you disagree with and come back, get sane, think about the public policy that you want, and let's form some coalitions to get that done. It's the only way we're going to save any of this.
Yeah,
and I think part of why there's such a lack of nuance sometimes within each group is that, if you feel under attack, you're not going to want to discuss things that might allow you to concede some ground. And as a result, some things that maybe should be conceded aren't.
That's right.
But part of that, it's ultimately it's a kind of a vicious cycle, because it is happening. Like the trans activists, the radical ones are attacking anybody who questions anything, and then the people which silences people, and then on the other side you have people just spewing hate and wanting to take away certain rights and freedoms, and so then everybody feels really threatened, so they're going to hold on. So that's unfortunate.
it's hard to have these conversations through Twitter or X.
Yes. It is
much easier when you're talking to someone like we are now.
No, because people I've never on any topic really. It's almost impossible for me I don't think I've had any really adversarial conversations. Like, people can disagree, but I've never had somebody attack me, threaten me, any of these things in real life. And that's because you're seeing the person. It's just, I think everything is so dehumanized on social media. You're this avatar, you're this identity, because they don't really know anything about you and they don't see your expressions. And when you're even being able to read somebody's face or verbal cues, like, that changes everything. Seeing that maybe something is upsetting. I remember I said something where I could tell that it triggered somebody next to me. I didn't really know this person very well, but I could read her expressions and I could see that it was something about what I said triggered her. So I said, "Hey, I noticed that, something I said, might have offended you. Do you mind explaining why?" And she told me, and I was able to address it, and it was fine. But we don't have that in the virtual world, and a lot of people are living in the virtual world, including me. We're
Yeah.
getting our sense of reality from the virtual world, but it's not really that representative of a lot of people. It's representative of people who post a certain way online.
Yeah.
But it's easy to get caught up in that. And yeah. What would your advice be for both of you? What would your advice be to somebody who's looking to learn more about this topic, that's more grounded in reality and facts, but is in this ecosystem of either chamber, really, on this topic, where things are just so heated? How would you recommend they approach the things they read online, and where else do you recommend they go to learn more?
The biggest thing I've learned in 10 years of being in politics right now is, if you don't talk to people on the other side and understand their arguments, you're not going to get anywhere. You will
Yeah.
not build the friendships that you need for coalitions to get things done. You're not going to be able to argue effectively, because you're going to be operating from one paradigm, they're going to be operating for another, and there's just not going to be communication. So, actually, I think this whole conversation started off with me asking Christina if I could read a bunch of her stuff. She gave me a link very generously to all of her past articles, and I literally just spent 2 days diving into it. I was really surprised to find out there was some of it I agreed with, a lot I didn't, but it made me better at advocating my position with this. So I think the first rule for anyone serious about politics is turn off the stuff that only comes from the side you want to agree with, and start understanding the arguments on the other side.
That is very well said. Uh, as far as getting information about this issue, I think New York Times has really stepped up in its reporting. But I became a journalist a couple of years ago because there was such a lack of good information out there on this topic. And the media landscape has changed for the better, I think, in the last couple of years. But there's still some places who, I just don't consider a trustworthy source. There are a lot of mainstream outlets who just haven't gotten it together, or are still not acknowledging the cast review. And I just don't understand how at this point they're not.
I've I've got a question for both of you, and being mindful of time, so it will be the last question. But what's one area that you of agreement with each other? Sorry, let's start with disagreement with each other. And what's one area where you feel like you're completely aligned?
I think I am in complete disagreement with Christina that the political project of allowing minors access to, gender affirming care, meaning very specifically puberty blockers and HRT, I think it's too far to completely blow the system up. I do not support that. I want higher standards. I want it slowed down. I want a lot more research. But I think the political mission of completely saying no is a bad one. I think she is completely correct in just so many things, like the meticulousness by which she does her research. I've never found a factual error in anything I've read of hers, and that's not true for most people in this space. No. I think she shows a lot of humanity and sophistication with this, and I think she has the best wishes of everyone at her core, and that's my mission, and I think that's why we're friends.
Yeah,
Love
that's
that.
really sweet. Thank you. Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, I don't want to blow anything up. I want medical organizations to act responsibly, and until that time, it's I don't, I mean, I support age restrictions on youth transition because I think it's a decision for adults to make. If medical organizations in the United States were doing their job, there wouldn't need to be laws put in place. Like if things weren't just left to run completely off the tracks, like we wouldn't need any of this legislation. So I think it's there to safeguard young people from this really reckless model of care. If they put in a different model of care, maybe things would be different, but that's just kind of where we are right now. Like I'm open to the idea that there are young people who would be happy with their transition if they transitioned younger, but it's just impossible to tell one from the other, from someone who is going to regret it in a few years. And that's just sort of why I land on the side of I don't think it's a good idea for youth to transition at all. So.
And what's the one area of agreement?
Oh, well, we agree. It seems we agree on a lot of things. I mean, we haven't actually discussed a lot of other topics, such as like the sports or the bathrooms and things like that. But so I'm not sure, but it seems like we agree on a lot of things.
Yeah, we do.
We might need a follow up on the other topics, which I think will be huge.
I mean, I have opinions on them, but I also like I try not to talk about anything that I don't know in extreme depth. Also,
that's a very noble thing, especially in today's age.
There's just so much I've had to reevaluate in the last few years that I've just become so skeptical of anything. Like I take everything with a grain of salt these days, because unless I have a lot of time to devote to investigating something thoroughly and like you said, Brianna, like from both sides of both points of view, examining the pros and cons, like it's just really hard to have like a strong opinion on a lot of different things these days. So I try to just stick to what I know.
Yeah. It's interesting because both of your positions where you do disagree, it seems to me. So Bree leans more towards protecting trans children who are legitimately trans and need that transition early, and versus Christina, in your case, it seems to me that you're more protecting the kids who might be harmed by this, who aren't really trans and are being misdiagnosed.
Well, I would like to say that we're talking about children who are experiencing gender-related distress. And whereas transgender is a term we give to somebody who has transitioned. So in the sense that there are young people who are under 18 who have transitioned, sure, there's transgender children, but whether or not they're going to be happy with that decision in the long term, we don't know. So I like to just call them children who are experiencing gender-related distress.
Actually, I know a lot of trans people disagree with this. I don't have an issue with that. I think I find it a very turfy term to call an adult trans-identified. I think that's just dehumanizing. There's no reason for that. It's not a medical term. It's not what trans people call themselves. It's just to delegitimize someone's gender identity. But I actually agree with you Christina, that I think if you're talking about a child, because there is such objectively a high rate of misdiagnosis right now, I think defaulting and calling them trans children is probably, I don't know. I agree. I appreciate the caution that you're bringing to them.
Yeah, and to your point too about calling adults transgender rather than trans-identified, you brought that up to me because I did that in a tweet, and I sometimes forget. But I think you're right. I think a more appropriate term for a lot of adults who are well on into their transition, and probably better term for them is transgender rather than trans-identified. I still hold out that there's a population of young adults in the 18 to 25 range who have a lot of other comorbidities and things like that.
Oh yeah.
So I still hold out that there are some people we should be cautious about in that sense. But I think we're going to have a lot of adults who are going to be happy with their transition in the long term.
And this is something we've been struggling with, just so you know, for literally since the 90s. Because when someone wants to transition, look, substance abuse, depression, clinical anxiety, autism, all this stuff, like it's just there. There's a huge, I don't think I've ever met a single trans person that did not have a comorbidity in my entire life. And this is a completely legitimate question. Do you treat the gender dysphoria first and then try to deal with the depression at the same time? Do you deal with the substance abuse first and then deal with the gender dysphoria? Or do you take away this thing that's possibly causing the really destructive behavior? This is a completely legitimate question. So I really appreciate the issue that you're bringing up.
Thank you so much to both of you for taking part in this conversation, and I think it's so important for people to be hearing people disagree with each other in healthy ways, agree with each other when there's moments of agreement, and have a more nuanced conversation about this topic. And maybe we'll do more.
I would love to do this. This is the best conversation about trans public policy I've literally ever had.
Well, I'm so glad, because both of you are, I think, a good conversationalist for this.
I try.
Yeah, well, I think I like when people approach things from a fact-based place, but I think sometimes anecdotal things are also important when somebody is well informed on that and has maybe access to a lot of people. But blending the two, I think, is important, and bringing the human side of it. And then I think just, again, being able to concede that things aren't just this one way, I think is really important. And a lot of us are figuring things out and learning and do mean well. And I know there are some topics we didn't dive into that might be more controversial or heated, which is, the bathrooms and sports and all of that.
We disagree on this topic.
Yeah.
So shame. Yeah.
I actually don't even know where you stand on that. Actually, we probably all agree is going to be my guess.
Probably.
But if we can have somebody with an even more varied perspective in the future who can handle themselves in this conversation, I think that would be good. But I thank both of you for taking part in this, and I'm learning and listening and appreciate it.
But Christina and I in charge of the public policy, and we'll get this thing solved in a week. I promise you.
That'd be nice.
I agree. I think it's the divisiveness that often and the fear is what really causes a lot of the issues that we're seeing. I think this is a little bit more possible to resolve than people think, but the conditions are making it very difficult, is my view.
Yeah.
Thanks for sponsoring this. I really appreciate
thank you.
it.
Thanks
Hope
again.
We can do it again another time. It was really great to talk to you both, and I learned a lot from Brianna too. And
and maybe
before we go, can I just fangirl over you a little bit, Catherine? Because the day you followed me was such a good day, because I've loved your stuff for so long.
Wow.
So getting to do a podcast with you is just awesome. So thank you for having us.
I appreciate that. I'd love to talk to you one day about our dissenting voices within the the left side of things, because I imagine we have a lot of notes to compare.
Yeah, we've been through it.
We've been through it. And I really appreciate your voice in terms of, to me, anybody who's bold enough to go against their tribe on some things and still not like leave, but it's very sad to me that dissent is something that is just not allowed by so many. But I think I see it changing. And again, I see it in private conversations with people. I don't have these issues. I really don't.
I agree.
Yeah. So we just need more of them, and we need more people willing to take the risk. And I think more people willing to be open and honest, and also engage in good faith and engage in this non-online, terminally online way, because it's not doing us any favors, which I think you can, when you I noticed this too when I was moderating conversations. When I was moderating conversations, and sometimes people would come in hot, right? But if you set the tone of discourse and how you conduct that discourse, and what standard of proof or thought is necessary to express your thought, how polite you have to be, I noticed that people would adjust because that became the culture of that conversation. And so I think with social media, we need to figure out ways to do the same thing. It's easier to do it in something like a space or a podcast, a lot harder over text. But even then, yeah, I know. But even then, I have people who absolutely have rethought how they engage and become better. And even when they, I remember there was one person in particular who I saw him engage in a way that I haven't seen him engage before, where it was quite inflammatory. And I said, I'm a little bit surprised with this. And he said, you know what, you're right. I should aim to do better and not let my emotions run things. And he went back and he changed the way he communicated.
Oh.
And you see that it's not, it doesn't always scale, but if you see a lot of people communicate in these ways that are more nuanced and good faith, people entering the conversation might be more likely to do the same. So yeah.
I love it. That's how we're going to fix this thing.
Perfect. Let's fix everything. Well, thanks again. I'll stop recording.